we live and move and have our story. In love, God lives in us and makes us whole. Oh, Jesus, may we hear the word that calls us near. Your story makes a home within our soul. Your story makes a home within our soul.
Welcome to StoryFest. And today we want to treat ourselves to the most popular of all the Bible stories, the Christmas story, the birth of Jesus. It's a powerful and a beautiful story, and it often gets hidden behind all the rest of the stuff that goes on at Christmas. But before we do that, I'd like to remind you just what it is we are doing on these StoryFest videos. You see, we listen to the story as a story, and what I mean is that we don't argue about what the story means or how much is history. Those discussions are important, but most of us, well, at least I, can only deal with one thing at a time. So I invite you to hear the story again as if for the first time, and just allow it to connect with the story in your soul. There's one part of the Christmas story that often gets left out. When Mary discovers that she's pregnant, she goes off to spend a couple of months with her cousin Elizabeth. Now, here's Linnea Good to tell us that part of the story from the Bible.
In those days, Mary set out and went with haste to a Judean town up in the hill country. And there she entered the house of Zechariah, and she greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard her greeting, the child leaped in her womb. And Elizabeth was filled with the Holy Spirit, and she exclaimed, "Blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb." How has this happened that the mother of the promised Messiah should come to me? For when I heard the sound of your greeting, the child in my womb leaped for joy. And blessed is she who remembered and who believed that there would be a fulfillment of all the promises God had made to her. Mary said, "My soul magnifies the Holy One, and my spirit rejoices in God my Savior. For God has looked with favor on the lowliness of this servant. Surely from now on, every generation will call me blessed. Mighty One, you have done great things for me. Holy is your name. You have shown strength with your arm. You have scattered the proud in the imagination of their hearts. You have brought down the powerful from their thrones. You have lifted up the lowly. The hungry you have filled with good things, and the rich you have sent away empty. You have remembered your servant Israel, mindful of your mercy, according to the promises made to our ancestors, to Abraham and to Sarah and to their descendants forever." Mary stayed with Elizabeth for about 3 months. Then she returned to her home.
The Christmas story is a story of power and pain, of fear and courage, of hate and love, of opportunity and danger, of beauty and ugliness. So, to help us get inside the story, here's our color commentator, Donald Schmidt.
It's very important to step back from that story the way we've received it so that we can really hear it. Part of that, I think, is to focus on this passage, this portion of it that we're dealing with today, that Linnea just presented and that we're going to do in some other versions. It's a very different story. It's not the idyllic couple in a stable that looks incredibly Western. It's the story of a prophet. A prophet who finds herself in a very, very precarious situation, which is common for prophets. You know, you read Jeremiah and others, and they often end up in very precarious situations. Mary finds herself in such a situation, and she goes to talk about it with Elizabeth. And when she does that, she makes an incredibly profound prophetic statement that tells us what Christmas is really about. Now, I don't know about you, but I could focus on the rich being brought down and the poor being lifted up, or I could focus on a really nice story of a baby and a mom and a dad in a stable, and that's far more comfortable and far more appealing. But the real story of what it's all about comes in this story of Mary's. So think of Mary, the prophet, and her bravery in this story.
When I hear these evocative Bible stories, I like to close my eyes for a little while and just try to imagine what it looked like, what the people looked like in the story, and how they were responding to the drama of the situation. You see, that's one of the great strengths of a story such as this, because we can imagine it happening in the theater of our own minds, and the people in the story are the people we know. So everyone hears the story differently, which is wonderful. And we asked artist Don McNair to see what it was that he visualized.
Now, I don't have any particular idea about how someone looks when they're ecstatic, and especially when they're ecstatic and in a situation of great danger. So, in this particular situation, I'm imagining that neither Elizabeth nor Mary actually consider themselves in danger, that in fact, Elizabeth, like Mary, sees that being pregnant like this is actually the supreme appointment. It's not a dilemma. However, I decided to include in this one someone who's not in the story, a third woman here, whose posture is much more like, as I would expect other people who don't know how to read the situation would respond to it. And that is to say, she is much more filled with anxiety rather than joy.
There's another way to let the story find its home within our souls. You see, when we let the Bible stories connect with the stories of our own life, it helps us to see more clearly, to know more nearly who we are, and to understand the dream God has for our lives. Now, because I'm a storyteller, my favorite way of doing that is based on an ancient Hebrew custom called the Agadah. In that tradition, the way to understand a story is to tell another story. So, here's my retelling of from my own imagination of the story of Mary's visit to Elizabeth. Mary's feet hurt. She'd forgotten how far it was from Nazareth to the hilltop home of her cousin Elizabeth. Mary had started out early that morning, trying hard to hide her morning sickness. A desperate and fearful child she was, all of 14 years old, making up stories and excuses so that she could go to visit her cousin. Why Elizabeth? Well, Mary wasn't sure, except that Mary knew Elizabeth had always loved her, even when she had felt less than lovable herself. And now, when Mary was in terrible trouble, she knew Elizabeth would love her still. Except that Elizabeth was married to a priest who was sworn to uphold the very law that would surely have Mary executed. Death by stoning was the punishment for girls who got pregnant before marriage. And now Elizabeth's house was just up the hill, and there was Elizabeth, big as life and pregnant.
Elizabeth, Mary!
The two women ran toward each other, embraced and cried and laughed.
Let me look at you, Mary.
With her wise old eyes, Elizabeth looked deep into the young and tragic eyes of her cousin and saw the pain there.
Mary, what's wrong?
The dam burst. The flood of tears, held back by courage and by fear, burst and spilled into the arms of the older woman who held the young one close until the flood had passed.
I'm pregnant, Elizabeth. Oh, God, help us.
It was not a curse.
God,
prayer.
help us. God, help us.
It's so hard to explain.
Then don't explain, Mary. Just know that regardless of what may have happened, I love you. And God loves you. Now, let's just sit down here in the shade and talk.
And talk they did, until the sun had set and they pulled their cloaks around themselves against the cold. They talked as only women who know pain and joy know how to talk.
Mary, I could feel my baby kicking inside me when I heard you call. That baby was glad to see you, Mary, glad to see you and the baby you are carrying. A child to come is God's promise of hope.
I know that, Elizabeth. There's one part of me that's full of joy and strong and hopeful. But there's another part of me that's angry and terrified and a coward. Sometimes I feel as if I'm two people.
Mary, do you remember an old song I used to sing for you? The one that was sung so many years ago by Hannah, our foremother, when she waited those long, long years for a baby? During all the long years I waited for God to send me a baby, that song helped me feel strength and patience, even when I was afraid and angry.
Quietly, and then with more and more strength, Mary began to sing the old, old song.
All that I am grows and expands and rejoices with God who has saved me. Small as I am, I grow and expand to the future with God who has blessed me. God's love offers life. God's strength is the love that brings justice and peace to all nations. God's love offers life to the poor and the meek who are raised from the ground where they suffer. All that I am grows and expands with God who brings life, hope, and justice.
Elizabeth looked at the slip of a girl called Mary, so thin, so vulnerable, and yet deep in those dark, youthful eyes, Elizabeth saw great strength, courage, and faith.
I don't know how, because I know all the laws and the customs of our people are lined up to destroy you, but somehow I believe God is with you. The child in my womb, the child in yours are God's gift of hope. Can you believe that, Mary? Even when everything seems to be painful and wrong, can you believe in the God who sang that song through you?
So, we heard the story of Mary and Elizabeth as it's told in the Gospel of Luke, and then we saw the story as seen through the imagination of artist Don McNair, and then we heard another version told by our Readers Theatre gang. So, where does it connect with your life? To really find the deepest gift of these stories, we need to find out how they connect with the story of our own lives. That was one of the best parts of these StoryFest events. At this one in Summerland, Linnea got us started by telling us how the story connected with her life.
I was given the invitation to just share where I personally connect with a story. So I'm glad that you're here and that we have until next week for you to listen to me connect with so many parts of this story. That's a sign of a good story, isn't it? When they're just so rich and so full. I connect with Zechariah, who is struck dumb, literally. I feel like my words are freed up when I get to speak from my head, and when I can say the things I believe and that I mean and that I've thought really through. They can just flow. When it's suddenly things I need to say from the heart, or a big shock about the direction that my life has gone in, I am struck dumb, and literally dumb. I know, and it doesn't come out. I often feel like I want to be able to speak about my relationship with others, and that's where the words suddenly just escape me. I love that he was given that time to think through and be ready for his answer. I connect with Elizabeth, who was long past the point where she really could believe that she was going to have her own child. So, and when she says, blessed are you, blessed is she who believed there would be a fulfillment of the promises that God made to her, I think what she's saying is, you young kid, you're wiser than I. You believed. I ran out of hope, and I went on my own path. You got it. I struggled for a long time to have a child, and so I truly connect with. In fact, our son's name is Isaac, and that's not by mistake. I just laughed and gaped and was amazed and cried and feared that it wouldn't work. And I remember saying, it was 10 years of not having a child. And I remember saying at one point in a group of people who were sharing their hearts, dumbly, I remember saying, this is a disability for me. This is the worst thing that could happen to me. I'd rather have cancer. And the woman I was talking to said, oh. And I realized I had said something I knew nothing about, that I had crossed a line I didn't understand. But I knew I wanted that baby so very badly, and I felt so cheated by not having that child. I relate to Mary, especially having had the gift, the privilege, the burden, the shock, the transformations of having 3 children. I relate to Mary. She is so happy. And she isn't just happy, I get my baby. She's so happy for what it means for the future. And the thing is, when you're suddenly pregnant, you aren't thinking about the long future. I get a baby. No, you don't. You get a baby for 6 months. Then you get a toddler. But you don't get them for very long. Then you get a child for a little while. Then you get a teen. And then you get a young adult. Then you get an adult relationship. I don't think I got that. I thought I'd get a baby. So Mary, she is able to look to the future in a way that I definitely was not able to. But not just her future, like the future, what this child means. And I often think about her and her joy. And when she says, surely for all time, all generations will call me blessed, I wonder what she means by that. Because if she had seen the future of her own child, I don't know. I don't think most mothers think she is that blessed, really. But she saw him in the bigger picture. And because we don't get a baby, we get a life and a relationship and somebody who affects the world. We take it as it comes. We take it as not something we got to shape and choose who you're going to be and what kind of a relationship we're going to have and who you're going to be in this world. We are gradually shaped into people. Hopefully, prayerfully, we're shaped into people who can actually cope with the real person who has come. And so Mary was shaped by that as she watched him grow and become the prophet, the Messiah that he was. And she became the prophet who was wiser still. All of this, I'm so humbled by parenthood, profoundly humbled by parenthood, and I'm so I'm so appreciative of the three different people and the three different ways of receiving that news.
So the Christmas story, especially the story of Mary's visit to Elizabeth, became part of Linnea's life. And your life too, if you let the story soak into your heart. Now, Bev, my friend and spouse for 60 years, was at this StoryFest, and she and I found ourselves connecting very personally to the story, as did most of the others who were gathered that day in Summerland.
But as Carrie passed over this little boy, there was suddenly inside of me a feeling that this was a special baby. I don't know why. I mean, he had ordinary parents. He had ordinary grandparents, you and I. Mm-hmm. But there was something as I held him. This child is different.
I did not have that experience when I first held Jake, but not very long after that. I was in a hospital in Victoria, holding my brother's hand as he was dying from congestive heart failure, and in my other hand I had a picture of this child. And somehow I sensed the mystery of that moment that I don't understand it. I mean, I can't explain it, but there was something beautiful and wonderful in that mystery of life and death at the same time.
The three people in the character just in the story didn't really resonate with me, but what did was her journey. Because I remember when I was 16, a friend of mine, we both got in a car from Victoria and we drove up to Kelowna, and it was a big journey, the first time that, well, while we could drive, that we could actually drive anywhere. And we chose to Kelowna, and that was quite an exciting, felt like we were adults. And then I was thinking about this story with a 14-year-old girl who's pregnant, walking 5 miles down the road at a different world, 2,000 years ago, a woman alone. Would have been quite that journey would have been her becoming an adult even before motherhood. And so I'm not sure, very different journey, but that part really resonated with me. And so I'm really curious about how she grew, how she made the decision to go to make those steps, started taking those steps, and how she really, by the time she got to Elizabeth, she was already a woman in a lot of ways.
Where this story touched me was I was remembering a number of years back when I was heading into ministry. I was already a staff associate at West Bank at the time and was heading into ordered diaconal ministry, and was traveling back and forth to work, going across the bridge, and that always seemed to be a significant metaphor for me. But listening one year in particular, as I was getting closer to graduation and commissioning, to Amy Grant's song "Breath of Heaven," where, she kept talking about, choosing me, and could there be somebody wiser to carry this child?
My son in his late teens was involved in a very serious car accident, flew out of the back of a truck out at Seymour Arm, crushed his pelvis, internal organs were all shredded, and we spent 10 years in and out of hospital. And I remember as a parent, my worry and concern, would he ever find anybody who could handle that? And certainly never expected that they'd have grandchildren. But the first miracle was, in fact, that he did. He and his partner had a wonderful baby girl, healthy, and the other miracle was that the baby was born on my birthday.
Mm-hmm. And, happy birthday, Rob. Yes. There is something wonderful about holding a new child. And I remember when Zoe was born, that sense of loving that baby, that I hadn't even seen the color of her eyes, and yet this intense love. And this is, for me, an experience of what grace is about. This love that is there, has no reason. I mean, she had not said word one. She hadn't done anything for me or anybody else. She had just been there, but she just was, and therefore she was loved.
And I was holding her in my arms, and I looked down at my hands touching her, and they weren't my hands, they were my mother's hands.
Oh, really? Yeah.
And I thought, wow, that's so weird. Like, where did my mother's hands come from? And then I realized that they were my hands, and that somehow my mother, who died several years ago now, was reaching out to this great-grandchild of hers through me. And it was just an amazingly powerful moment for me as I realized that Alice and Kathy and Olivia were one.
So little Charlotte was born at 28 weeks, so she was about this big, just a wee thing. And so I immediately got on a plane from Kamloops to Calgary and was there the next day. And this little mite was in an incubator, and it's really, really difficult to connect through an incubator.
I'm sure.
There's a distance, right? We were allowed to touch, but not to stimulate at all, just a brief touch, but that was it, through the windows. So went home to Kamloops. Derm and I had a trip, and then a week later went back to Calgary. And during that week, the young mom and dad had begun the kangaroo holding, which is skin to skin with the baby. So in I came now, this 1 week later, and there was my daughter holding the baby, my baby holding her baby, so tenderly, and I'll never forget it. This baby is now the most exuberant, joyful bundle of bright energy. She's like a comet. She's 9 years old, and she's an awesome person.
And that's a totally objective statement from a grandmother, right?
I think it was when Linnea was talking that I can remember the thought occurred to me that when I had children, I didn't know I'd have them forever. I thought there was a certain amount of time, and then all of a sudden there were children, and then there were partners, and then their grandchildren, and it seemed to extend. And each time it extended, I was surprised, because the ripples just went on and on. And I think the joy of it is that there's all these new families that weren't there at the beginning. And all of a sudden, what I've learned is that I have this huge family. And then the boundaries disappeared, because then those children's families became family. And about that phrase, it takes a village to raise a child, well, that village has become wider and wider. And I feel so blessed in that, because there are all kinds of people I think, I would never have got to know these people, and all of a sudden, isn't this interesting? They have that life or that experience. And so I feel so blessed and richer for having realized, well, I thought I'd have them forever, which might have seemed like a burden. It wasn't. It's been a complete blessing.
Thank you, Mary.
Everything is possible. We have everything we need. We gather up tomorrow, all that yesterday was seed. Everything is sacred. Love will always show the way. Where we come from, where we're going, living in the gift of today. Everything is possible. We have everything we need. We gather up tomorrow, all that yesterday was seed. Everything is sacred. Love will always show the way, where we come from, where we're going, living in the gift of today. We go where we come from, where we're going, living in the gift of today.
The Christmas celebration is shared by our whole society, and I think that's because it's the fundamental story of hope, of a new baby, a new life, new possibilities. And as cynical as we may get about the commercialization of Christmas, deep down we sense the fundamental holiness of the Bible story of Mary and Joseph and the baby Jesus in Bethlehem. We can hide it under piles of tinsel, but the story seems to find a way to shine through. If we spend time with the story, if we live with the story and allow it to do its work inside our souls and help us find the holy stories in our own lives, then we can receive spiritual gifts at Christmas that many others can't even imagine. So I hope that you will talk with others about what you've seen and heard on this program and discover the richness and beauty, the holiness that lives in your heart. It's there, but it takes a bit of effort and a bit of risk, too, sometimes to discover it. Now, before you go, let me just remind you about the Woodlake Productions website, where you can download a free copy of that little drama we just presented, including a copy of the music and the words for the song that Helena Moore sang for us. That's a version of what we usually call the Magnificat, and Francis Chason wrote the music. Now, all you have to do is to go online and search woodlake.com to find those items and a bunch of other resources, including my most recent book, The Gift of Story. It's a good read. You should check it out. And you can also find a story book called Angels in Red Suspenders that I wrote a couple of years ago. It's a batch of really fun stories, too. Now, there are 9 videos in this StoryFest series, which you can watch in any order you like. If you're not doing it already, why not gather a group of friends to watch these videos with you so you can talk about them together? The experience is always much richer, and the whole thing is more fun when you do it with friends. In the meantime, please remember that God's gift of hope and love comes to us at Christmas and every day and every moment of our lives. It's there for everyone, you included.
Your story makes a home within our soul.